I'm Blum. I've been involved here in the Bunch Center for a very long time. I've taught at UCLA since 1980, but I've taught at the University of California since 1968. So I go back a very long time. This is my 44th year as a university teacher, and I think that my energy level is very strong, and I intend to continue to do this for a very long time to come. I have had the very good fortune of being involved in the Bunch Center and its multifaceted activities for a long time. And I've also had the very strong privilege of being able to publish a lot, including my most recent book before this, called Resistance, Dignity, and Pride, about African American art, which is, for me, an extraordinary passion, and with which I now continue, because I'm the co-curator of a big exhibition that we're going to have at the California African American Museum in the fall called Places of Validation. And I'm working with a number of people and really putting together what I think will be an extraordinarily promising exhibition about the institutional history of African American art from the end of the Second World War until 1980 and beyond. I have written a lot. I've been fortunate to publish a lot of stuff, especially about the arts. But in the last several years, because I've talked about my own experiences in the civil rights movement, generations of students have asked me to write it down. Kiran has been my TA in my class last quarter on the history of agitational movements, and I do one class session where I talk about my own experiences in the civil rights movement, and some of them are very dramatic. And so for years, students have asked me to finally put it down. So I finally did in this book, A Life at the Margins. As my wife says, now finally I can write about and talk about my absolute favorite topic, myself. So this is the full manifestation of my obvious narcissism. But it's kind of fun to write about yourself and get it all down. And what I've done in this book is to write about the activity that has informed everything I've done as an academic. I tell my students at the beginning of every quarter that there's nothing that's objective or neutral. In fact, there's nothing balanced about any of my classes. My students come to realize very early on that I'm possibly the most unbalanced person they'll ever see. None of my students has to agree with me, but I make it very clear that I'm going to talk very specifically about things that concern me. And race is at the top of that hierarchy. Let me tell you a little bit about what I wrote. I come from a very political family, and that's the early part. Just briefly, my father was the only survivor in a Holocaust family. And that kind of background fundamentally informed everything he did, and it had a huge impact on my life. He was the only survivor. My grandfather, my grandmother, and my aunts and uncles all were murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz. My father was the only survivor. When he came to the United States, he knew not a word of English. But very early on, and intuitively, he understood that the same racism that killed his entire family, not just his immediate family, but the extended family, that same racism was the racism that was directed against the African American population. So even in the 40s, the late 40s and early 50s, my father became a strong civil rights activist in the United States. That was during the time when they called civil rights activists premature anti-racists, at the time before it became more or less popular in the United States. I will fast forward ahead in the interest of time. My parents were involved politically early on. My parents were involved in Philadelphia after my father returned as an honorably discharged veteran from the Second World War. It was interesting because my father was a U.S. Army intelligence officer. As a native German speaker, he was involved in interrogating some of the captured German officers, and actually was dispatched to Berlin, where he was involved in the interrogation of captured Nazi war criminals. He was involved in the events leading up to the Nuremberg trial, which must have been a particularly difficult time emotionally, because he was back in the setting where his own parents had been captured by the Gestapo and taken off first to Theresienstadt and then to the extermination in Auschwitz. But when he came back, he was fueled by a hatred for racism. And he came to Philadelphia, started a family like a lot of the World War II veterans. And my earliest recollection, this dates me to be sure, comes in 1948, when in Philadelphia, where I grew up, they had the Progressive Party Convention, which was the third party insurgency against the hegemony of the two-party system. And my parents were involved in the candidacy of Henry Wallace, which was one of the first major leftist insurgencies against the two-party system. And I was 5 years old, and I actually remember the Progressive Party Convention. I have a very good memory. I actually remember everybody who ever slighted me. So, I mean, I carry a lot of this. But my parents introduced me to people from California who were at the convention. What I don't remember, or only remember hazily, is when they introduced me to a very large black man named Paul Robeson, who was, of course, one of the primary movers and shakers of the Progressive Party in 1948, and who later became one of the central heroes of my life, and for whom I became, you know, really kind of one of the persons who's written extensively about Robeson. I continue to write about Robeson. That was my first class here well over 20 years ago in Afro-American Studies. And in fact, this summer I'm going to be teaching at the invitation of Charles Henry, who was one of our Thurgood Marshall speakers a couple of years ago. I'm going to be teaching my Paul Robeson class in the Department of African American Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. So I continue to be involved in that part. But my parents were like a lot of young families. They had lots of children. I'm the oldest of 5. All of us retain the same progressive political vision. But like so many young families, we grew up in the inner city, and then in the early 50s, we moved to the largest urban, suburban development north of Philadelphia, Levittown, Pennsylvania. Now, Levittown has a kind of storied history. There were 3 Levittowns. One was in New York, Long Island, the other was in Pennsylvania, and the third was in New Jersey. And I think my parents moved there in the early 1950s because it was a kind of nice place to raise children. I hated it. I found it supremely boring. It didn't have the grit of a city, and all it had was kind of uniform suburbia. But what was fascinating, my parents didn't know when they bought it, but learned almost immediately thereafter, was that William Levitt, the largest builder in the United States, himself the grandson of a rabbi, refused to sell to African Americans. He absolutely categorically refused to sell to black families. And when my parents moved to Levittown, it was an all-white development. And I remember as a child my parents talking about that, and I remember them talking with other families about the egregious racism of that environment. And because I was the oldest and kind of politically motivated, there were a series of meetings that my parents had with other sympathetic white families about what we could do about the color line in Levittown. And I said, I want to come to those meetings. I mean, I have very, very vivid recollections of that. There were meetings in my family's home, there were meetings in other people's houses, and this went on for about a year or a year and a half, and I tagged along. I was too young, obviously, to participate, but I just found it strikingly fascinating to listen. We need to buy a house, or we need to arrange a sale of a house, and then make sure an African-American family is able to do that. There was a kind of air of conspiracy about it, all of which I write about in the book. I just found it fascinating, a lot more interesting than school, which I found dreadful and boring and repressive. This was conspiratorial. School was just deadly. So I went to these meetings, and as these meetings went on, the plans began to materialize. And by early 1957, they were ready to go. There were 5 or 6 families who were involved in this grand conspiracy. And by the summer of 1957, it was ready for this first African-American family, Bill and Daisy Myers, to move in. And they were a wonderful family. They were like my father, Bill Myers, the first black family. He was a veteran of World War II. He was an engineer. Daisy Myers was a school teacher. And during the summer, I don't remember anymore just the mechanism about how they went about effecting the transfer. But the house was sold, and Daisy Myers kept coming in order to clean the house and get it ready. You can imagine what the white neighbors thought. They thought, oh, she must be the maid. But she kept coming back. She kept coming back. And that started generating suspicion among the white neighbors. And it's really easy to find out who owns a house. Extraordinarily easy. All you have to do is to go up to the county clerk and find out what the property transfers are. And in due course, the local conservative newspaper, the Levittown Times, went up to the county seat and found that the property had actually been sold to William and Daisy Myers. And they got wind of that, and they wrote in the newspaper, Levittown's first Negro family, using the language of the time, is to move in. And as I write in the book, and as I've spoken often in class and elsewhere, they might as well have said, the mob will convene at 6 p.m. On August 17th, 1957, because that's precisely what happened that evening. One of the most remarkable and traumatic evenings of my life. We knew there would be opposition. One of the sympathetic families, the Wexlers, lived right next door because we felt we ought to have one of the families very close by. We all went to the Myers house the night they walked in. And I shall never forget that night as long as I'm on this planet. Because that night, a hostile white mob gathered outside. And the racist invective was just ubiquitous. Nigger, 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 nigger. It was just horrible that went out. And there was a white police officer standing right across the street. It's seared in my memory. And instead of protecting the people, which of course was his sworn duty, it's in my consciousness. He was out there swigging a bottle of beer and egging on the white mobs to do it. And as the evening went on, all of a sudden we heard the glass break. And we tried to call out to get some of the supporters. They cut the phone lines. And by the time the windows started shattering, I don't remember who it was. It was either my father or another person who was there. We had the sympathetic families, and we had some union support. Somebody knocked me to the ground, and we retreated next door because it was just too dangerous. Finally, somebody got through to the governor of Pennsylvania, who's still alive in his mid-90s, a man named George Leader, and he sent out the state police and temporarily quelled the mob. But for the next several weeks, every single night, a hostile white mob gathered outside the home of the Myers. And the white resistance formulated themselves into what they called, oddly and inappropriately, the Levittown Betterment Association. It's interesting how you can distort language. And they erected a house. They put up this huge Confederate flag. Now this is not Alabama. This is not South Carolina. This is Pennsylvania. This is 10, 12 miles north of Independence Hall in 1957. And they put up a public address system and they blared Dixie 24 hours a day. And they had caravans driving along screaming, "Nigger, go home." And they had, I mean, again, seared in my memory, they had a little black, an adorable little Cocker Spaniel. They marched in front of the Myers house day in and day out, and they called the little Cocker Spaniel, this will come as no surprise, Nigger. They called him, "Here, nigger, nigger, nigger," up and down. They burned at night, they painted KKK on the Myers house, on the Wexler's house, and every time we went there, we were pelted with racist invectives. The most traumatic thing happened 3 or 4 weeks later. We lived about 3.5 miles away. I got up in the middle of the night in September of '57. I thought the house was on fire. I thought we just had a fire. And I moved from my bedroom into the bedroom of my then infant sister because I smelled smoke. And then I looked outside her bedroom. There was a 10 or a 12-foot cross burning on our lawn, and it was wrapped with oily rags with bullets that were flying off into the side of the house. Fortunately, none of those bullets penetrated the house itself. But I saw the people driving away. They were 2 members. One was named Ben Cliff, the other was named Williams. They were both members of the Ku Klux Klan. Again, not Louisiana, not South Carolina. This is Pennsylvania. And they were in due course apprehended. Later in December, they were brought to trial. I testified at 14 in that trial. I actually was able to retrieve the testimony. I have 2 pages in the book of my testimony. I actually held up well in the testimony. It's amazing what adversity will do, especially in generating a certain verbal capability. And I testified. I have that. The person who prosecuted the case was the State Attorney General, Tom McBride, because he did not trust the local authorities to actually do the prosecution. He didn't trust them. After I testified, it was scary when you're a 14-year-old kid. I was done my testimony, and I went up the steps in the courthouse, and I was going to get a Coke or a candy bar or something. 2 members of the Klan got me, and they pushed me around, and they knocked me down a flight of steps. And I went and I told the Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania. They never apprehended them, but he was supremely pissed off. And he gave me a look that was kind of a cold fury. This went on for months and months. Children in the neighborhood couldn't play with us. My brother was beaten up. I was in 9th grade. That's a tough time generally. It's a horrible time actually. And nobody called me Paul. Everybody, not everybody, the teachers were hostile. Most of the students were hostile. Every time I rode my bicycle in the neighborhood, you know, I couldn't ride a half a mile without people taunting me as nigger lover. I was called nigger lover thousands of times. I remember, you know, in our class last quarter, in the final paper, one of the ones that I was looking at, the quizzes, one of the students said, well, Professor von Blum was called Negro lover. And I can tell you, Nobody ever called me Negro lover. I mean, I understand why they didn't want to use the rock, but nobody ever called me Negro lover. We should be very clear about what was going on at the time. It was a pretty horrible time. This went on for a long time. Basically, I was booted out of the public schools because it was so traumatic, and my parents put me into a private Quaker prep school, which everybody liked, but which I found unusually obnoxious. And one day, when we were doing carpooling, my father sometimes drove us, and I went to the house of a Quaker family who was involved in our conspiracy. And I was just hanging around waiting for her. She taught the adjacent Quaker elementary school next to the one that I went to. And I was just kind of hanging around. I had 15 or 20 minutes before we were ready. And this was one of the most remarkable moments of my life. I was not going to do homework. I was not psychologically prepared to sit there and do homework. And I was kind of walking around, and I noticed that their file cabinet was open. And I always tell my students, you're not supposed to look at other people's open file cabinets. But I did, because I was curious and bored. And I was going through, and the A's were boring, and the B's were boring. But the C's were fascinating. There was a file that said, Communism in Lower Bucks County. And that's where we were, in Bucks County, north of Philadelphia. And I found that kind of curious. So I took it out. Nobody else was in the room. And I looked at it, and I saw names. I saw the names of the other people who were involved. And then I went down to the V's. I saw the names of my parents, Peter and Selma von Blum. These bastards were FBI informants. These people who were ostensibly on our side were also reporting us. And there was a reporter maybe 10, 12 years ago who actually, through the Freedom of Information Act, confirmed that. That's why my father kept getting fired. That's why he couldn't hold on to a job, because of the taint. This was late McCarthyism, and people, I think, have to know that. And it's my job as an educator to convey that to my students. What happened, in short, was that because of the taint of left-wing associations, we finally, in 1959, moved from the Philadelphia area to California, because we needed to get out of there. It was just the Red Scare was still in it was dying out, but it hadn't disappeared. So we moved to California, and by that time I was just about ready to finish high school. And I was so committed to this struggle, having been through what I saw, that it was inevitable that I would join the civil rights movement. And that part becomes a major theme in my book. I mean, I write extensively. By the time I graduated from high school, I knew I had to join the civil rights movement. And I knew that I lived in San Diego, so I joined that. San Diego is a very tough place to be a civil rights activist, especially in the early 60s, a Navy town. But I knew that I had to go south, and I did. I mean, as soon as I was capable, I went and I drove to Atlanta, Georgia, and I became very involved with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I made repeated trips there, and that formed the whole foundation of the ideology that I continue to have. I think one of my chapters is called Civil Rights, My Most Enduring Commitment. I've been politically active on a lot of levels, but that has been the foundation. And much of my story is some of the events, including the dramatic events, like the early sit-ins that I was involved in. My students always love the police stories, the assorted jailings that we had. Anybody who was in the South understood that there was always confrontation with the authorities, and I had my own dramatic examples, and I detail a lot of them. I also detail what happened to me in San Diego, because SNCC was a Southern organization, and I did organizing for them in Alabama and in Louisiana. In Louisiana, I got beaten up by a couple of white thugs. And we had learned about nonviolence. I got beaten up and I picked myself up, and there was one case where the New Orleans police, after I'd gotten beaten up, went to the white thugs and said, "Are you hurt?" Not me, but the white thugs who beat me up, and they said, "You want to press charges? Apparently you can be guilty of assault and battery with your ribs against the feet of your assailants." I mean, it was that kind of lunacy that went on in the South. The critical thing that happened to me, though, occurred in San Diego, because SNCC was a Southern organization, and so the group with which I was associated in California was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And I did organizing all over California. In LA, I was on Central Avenue a year before the Watts Rebellion. I mean, I go back a long time in this struggle. I worked in the Bay Area. I took part in some of the demonstrations there. I was sent to Arizona by CORE, where we occupied the governor's office, and that's where I was taken out. That was the most enduring injury. I had my 2 bottom teeth knocked out by a white cop who took me out after I was removed from the State House, and when nobody was looking. He took me behind a car and punched me in the face. And, you know, fortunately, we have really good restorative dentistry, so they can fix that kind of. But that was good. Look, one of the things that I have to say is that the real heroes of the civil rights movement are not people like me. It's the ordinary African Americans who were there. I could go back to California. They had to stay there. They are the real heroes. To use Hollywood terminology, we're supportive actors, and that's where we could come back. But in San Diego, we organized against the Bank of America for CORE. And by that time, I had gotten to be relatively effective as a speaker and as an organizer. And in June of 1964, I had helped to organize a series of demonstrations, which I detail again in the book, against the Bank of America. And I was arrested, not by the San Diego police, but by the bank manager of the main branch of the Bank of America. I love that. You know, you wonder whether a bank manager learns about how to make a citizen's arrest during his MBA training. But I was then immediately transported to the jail. It was not a pleasant experience. And then I was hauled up on 3 misdemeanor offenses, convicted swiftly. There were a number of us who were arrested, and they chose me to be the one to testify. I'm verbal, I have a big mouth, and I'm not fearful. And I held my own, but notwithstanding that, it was impossible to, especially with an African-American attorney, there was no way I was going to be found not guilty. And I was found guilty after the jury went out for about an hour, just enough time to get 1 meal from the state. And then after I was found guilty, the judge was an old Virginia racist named Luther Hussey. He had me stand up in the court, and he spent about 20 or 30 minutes excoriating me, saying that he didn't want to hear anything about my being a political prisoner, that I was no different from any common criminal who had ever been convicted in his courtroom. And he said, I'm just any common criminal, like a thief, like a vandal, and that he would refer me to the probation officer. And I think the next day or 2 days later, I went to see the probation officer, whose first question to me was, Paul, are you sorry for your crime? And I said, of course not. Why would I be sorry for my crime? I'm glad of the crime. That's why we did it. So I went back to the judge, and he called me into the chamber, and he said, I'm thinking about putting you on probation for 3 years. This was for 3 lousy misdemeanor offenses. And he put me on probation for 3 years. Everybody else got 6 months of probation, except for me. I got 3 years, and it was formal probation, which meant I had to report to a probation officer. And, all right, I could do the 3 years probation, but then we had the life-altering reality. What happened? He said, I'm going to impose various conditions. You were arrested at the Bank of America. He said, I'm also going to make you write 3 term papers to meet the high intellectual standards of the San Diego Municipal Court. The first one was called The Contributions of the Bank of America to the Social and Economic Progress of California. You talk about Kafka. This was Kafka. This was Kafka. The second one had to be on the growth of PSA Airlines, so I could learn about the free enterprise system. And the third, these were 20-page papers. The third one had to be 40 pages. And I had to prove that racial discrimination was caused by labor unions. I'm serious. And so I had to write these. And so I said, all right, I'll write the papers. Because he said, you don't have to accept these conditions. And if you don't, I'll sentence you to 6 months in the San Diego County Jail. And I said, all right, I'll do them. He said, there's one other thing. And that was the life-altering reality for me. He said, I'm going to require that you go to law school. And that was a life changer, because I had been accepted to the PhD program at Berkeley in political science. And I had given them my acceptance. There were people in political science and political theory with whom I wanted to study. And he said, I see from your record that you had also applied to law school and you had been accepted. And I told him, yeah, I had, but I decided I wanted to go to law school, especially after the trial. I didn't want anything to do with the law. And he said, you don't have to accept it, but then you can do 6 months in jail. So I was really shaken, and I said, I'll do it. I went up to Berkeley, I enrolled at Bold Hall, and I started the legal curriculum. 2 weeks later, I found that law school was totally preposterous, and I quit. I went back to the political science department, and I said, can I have my fellowship that you promised back? And they said, sure. And I actually enrolled 2 weeks into the semester in the political science department, and I knew I would have to write to the judge and explain that, and I did. And I thought I was being tactful, but apparently I wasn't. He then sent me back a telegram. My students now have no idea what a telegram is. But he sent me back a telegram, and it said, you have 48 hours to get back into the law school, and if I don't have that evidence, he will rescind my probation and issue a bench warrant for my arrest and impose the 6-month sentence. And I was really shaken. I didn't know what to do. And I thought about it, and I finally went back to the law school. Not willingly and not happily, and I did it. I finished. I did it. I write about all of that. I finished Bold Hall. I took and passed the bar exam. I pay $410 a year. I still keep my license up, but it is a marginal part of who I am. Most of you know me. I don't do that. I write about art history. I spent a lot of my time looking at art while I was in Berkeley. I took part in the free speech movement, totally in violation of my order of probation. And when I finally finished, I actually had the audacity to go to the rhetoric department in Berkeley, and I said that only a 24-year-old could say, I can do this, I can be a good teacher, you should hire me. And astoundingly, they did. And I said, I think I can do this. And they hired me. And I've been teaching ever since. I realized early on, I started developing a very, very good teaching record. And I've been able, I think, to keep that intact since, the end of the 1960s. And then I started, in 1972, after I got fired from the rhetoric department. I've been fired a lot at the University of California. And I fought back. To say that my academic career has been unorthodox is kind of my April understatement. But I fought back each time, and I'm still here. I detail a lot of that. It's been an unusual academic career. And I've done it on my own terms, not without a great deal of turmoil. But it's an interesting model for survival. It's been political. because I've fought back with union support, with student support each time, and I've had support from sympathetic faculty throughout that turbulent 44-year period. But it's been an unusual life, and I'm in extraordinarily good health, so I intend to continue to do this. What it shows, I hope, especially for my younger readers, is that you can do this kind of thing on your own terms. It's not without a price. But the point that I make to my students is that if you compromise, if you abandon your ideals, that's an even greater price. That to just abandon your ideals, you pay a much higher price than not to implement your ideals. So I'm going to continue to do it. I'm going to continue to be politically active. I'm going to continue to speak out against racism. And I'm going to continue to do courses where I hope to inspire young people to take their skills and move it out into the arena of life and to get the hell out of Westwood. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, during your stay at UCLA, what would you consider one of your greatest challenges?
The greatest challenge is Murphy Hall, because and it's the same as in Berkeley, there is a major resistance to doing interdisciplinary work. There's major resistance to doing to making teaching your major priority. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric about that, but there really is a gap between the institutional rhetoric and the reality. This is a research factory, and I've done a lot of research. It's unorthodox research, but I've published 6 books and maybe 100 articles. I've done a lot, but I've been very clear. My top priority is to deal with my students. And I've been outspoken. I've written critical articles on education, and I'm going to continue to do that. I'm much too old to change course on any of this, but I've seen that. I mean, and I am a senior lecturer, and I've never been a latter faculty member. There is, and I'm very blunt about it, there is a system of academic apartheid here. And they don't want to admit it, but it's the reality. There is a second-class citizenship here. And whenever you say it, they go through this system of semantic acrobatics, but it's the reality. I know it.
So given your love of politics in particular, why did you choose art history as a focus for much of your work?
I like the arts. I started, I'm always a little reticent to tell my students, but when I grew up in Philadelphia, I used to skip school. I know you're not supposed to do that, and I used to go to the Philadelphia Art Museum, the place where Rocky did his stuff. And I don't know what I was seeing, I just liked it. And it was the civil rights movement that really generated it. I worked at the historically black colleges where I was doing work for SNCC, because I couldn't stay in the white sections of Atlanta. I was identified as being one of them. So I stayed at Morehouse, at Morris Brown, and some of you may know that at Atlanta University, they have the great murals by Hale Woodruff. And I noticed that and I was kind of drawn to the art. And I also knew that African American art was intrinsically historical, social, and political. And when I joined the Division of Interdisciplinary and General Studies at Berkeley in 1972, my chair was a man named Alan Renoir. And he said, "Paul, this is Berkeley, you got to write a book." I thought, my God, you write a book. And he said, "What do you want to write it on?" I said, "I'm interested in art and I'm interested in politics." And he said, "Do it." And I wrote my first book called The Art of Social Conscience, a kind of comprehensive history of art and politics. And Alan, who's now gone, gave me carte blanche to do that kind of work. He was a really interesting guy. He was the grandson of Pierre Auguste Renoir and the son of Jean Renoir. I used to visit him at his home in Piedmont, and you'd go to his house and he would have his grandfather's paintings, Renoir paintings, hanging on nails, and his wife would come and straighten them out. Wonderfully idiosyncratic guy, but he really gave me carte blanche to write about that. I always just liked the arts. And then at Berkeley, there were a couple of people like Peter Seltz and Herschel Chip, who they were really socially oriented art historians. And then in '80, when I came here, there was Al Boyne, my late friend, who became, not only a colleague and a mentor, but a close personal friend. So I always had art historical mentors. And in the African American community, it was Samela Lewis, the dean of African American art historians, who 30-some years ago brought me into this arena. So I've always had major scholars who assisted me with this process. I'm one of the few people writing art history who never ever had an art history course in my life. I just learned it on my own. Anybody else? Well, I did bring a couple of copies of the book if anybody's interested. There are several copies in the UCLA bookstore. They were not able to bring copies because they're gearing up for the Festival of Books. But I brought a few extra from my own. I would be happy to discount it for anybody if you want to do it. It goes for $29.95. I'm happy to. I can only do it with a check because I have to send it, but I'd be willing to forego my royalty. I've made enough royalties in my books to keep me more or less in frozen yogurt over the years. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.